Okay, so here we go. So we're going to talk about getting great color in Blurb books. And interestingly enough, even if you're not going to be producing a Blurb book with all the pictures that you're using, the things I'm going to go over in Photoshop will apply to just any printing anywhere, whether you're sending out to a lab or to your own desktop printer. So it'll be useful for that as well. So today's webinar is sponsored by both Blurb and X-Ray. Take a look at both of their websites. There's a lot of great information on both websites, a lot of tutorials, a lot of how-tos that will really help you get things going. And I'm your host today. My name is Joe Brady. If you haven't spent any time with me online before, I am the Webinar Marketing Manager at the MAC Group in Elmsford, New York, and I create and present educational materials primarily for professional photographers. I'm a photographer myself, and I am a Blurb book user, which I'll show you my book at the end. And I tell you a little bit of my background, mostly to illustrate that I use all this software and these functions in my everyday work. And in the past, I have run into some of the same problems that I'm sure you all have. Since I took control of color, I'm able to get great results back from everyone who produces prints for me, whether I have a book done or if I'm printing on my own desktop printer or I'm sending out to a lab. So the things I'm going to show you today are going to apply to all of those possibilities. Now we're going to work today primarily in Photoshop. I'm going to be using CS5. I'm not going to do anything that is peculiar to CS5, however, so if you have an older version of Photoshop, that will be just fine. And we're going to prepare images first for placement in Blurb's BookSmart program, and then we'll do a couple of more more adjustments to the image to prep it to go into a desktop publishing program such as Adobe's InDesign. So what are the issues that we need to take control of today? We're going to start out with the display. It might not be obvious at first glance, but your monitor is probably the single most important component for anyone editing digital files. Think about it. That's where you're making all your decisions, so obviously it's got to be good. So I'll discuss if it's helping or hindering your efforts, and we're going to make sure that it's performing to the best of its ability because I'm going to briefly talk about calibration and profiling. Now, color spaces. Color spaces often get confused with profiles. I'll talk a little bit about what part they play in color workflow and what has to happen to put your photos in the best format for printing in a Blurb book. Now, for you to really see how your image is going to print before you actually send it out to the lab or your desktop printer or having a book done, you need to know how to soft-proof in Photoshop. This one step will eliminate most of the unexpected and unwelcome surprises. And then finally, we'll make sure we've done everything necessary to send out a completed book to Blurb, either using the BookSmart program or, again, something like InDesign. Now, here's the basic problem. The printer used for printing books at Blurb operates in CMYK. Our cameras capture in RGB, and when we print to our own desktop printers, RGB, again, is what they're usually looking for, but they're going to then translate it into CMYK for their own inks. By learning how to create files adjusted to the correct color space, we'll get more accurate and consistent results when we have our books printed. So our goal is to produce consistent color on different devices. And unfortunately, each device has its own way and own capabilities of capturing and representing color. I mentioned our cameras and monitors are RGB and our prints are produced with CMYK. The other issues we have is our cameras can capture much more color than either our monitors can show or our printers can print. So we need some way to translate and move around colors so that they'll match as closely on one device as our original capture in our edit. And since each device has a different range, or a gamut as it's called, of colors that can be produced, we need to understand that there's going to be some colors that are going to move, and I hate to say it, but occasionally you're going to have a color you just cannot print. However, we're going to get this under control as well as possible by using profiles and soft proofing that allow us to see a print before it's printed so that we can make adjustments to get the best results we want. So here's some points that I'll cover today that will help with produce consistent color. First of all, think about it right at capture, right at the beginning. If your color temperature and white balance is set correctly at capture, that'll mean much less processing and editing will be necessary later on. Also, your monitor. as I mentioned. I'm going to harp on this one a little bit because it's really important. If your monitor is not calibrated and profiled, then none of your editing decisions concerning color and tonal range are going to be correct. And again, I mentioned soft proofing. Soft proofing is a great tool in Photoshop where it allows us to see the image through the output profile, so how the output device is going to actually produce the color before we actually go ahead and do that. Let's take a brief look at capture. Now, white balance is something that confuses the heck out of people, and even worse so, custom camera profiles. This is a picture of me just holding up a X-Ray ColorChecker Passport, and this is one of my absolute favorite tools. I'm not going to talk about it in detail today. In fact, I just did a webinar on this yesterday, so you can go on to xwritephoto.com and see the archive of it. But it is one of the greatest tools for getting your color under control. I'll come back to it more in just a minute. Now, if you shoot RAW and your files were captured with the correct white balance, it leaves one less variable to correct for. Now, it's true, in a RAW file, your color temperature hasn't been embedded into the file yet. But if you have it set correctly at capture, it'll speed up your workflow a couple ways. First of all, that white balance data does travel along with the file, even though it isn't embedded in it. So when you open your image in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever it is you use, it's already there. It's perfectly correct. You're not going to have to go looking for an image that's got a white balance card so that you can reference off of. Secondly, that image that shows up on the back of your camera is a JPEG that's processed using whatever your settings are currently on the camera. So even if you're shooting RAW, your preview is going to be a JPEG. So if you have that set correctly, again, it's going to give you the best possible result. Now, all right, here's the one I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask everybody to do this. No more auto white balance. Stay away from it. It's going to be a disaster for creating books or a lot of your photography. If you can't custom white balance, choose a color temperature that closely matches the ambient light. If it's sunny out, choose the sunlight icon. If it's cloudy, use that. The problem with auto white balance is it recalculates white for every image. If somebody new walks into the frame and they're wearing some kind of, I don't know, some bright clothing, it's going to change the color. If you move the camera a little bit, it's going to change the color. It's going to recalculate both the white and exposure. You can really see this if you've ever tried to stitch together, say, a panoramic where the sky just will not match. Even if you're doing a book or, say, an album with people in it, having auto white balance is going to make the skin tones change slightly for each shot, and it's either going to require a lot of editing or you're going to have a page of portrait images that just don't quite look right. So the moral of this story is stay away from auto white balance. Pick a color temperature if you don't have time to custom white balance, and you can then make adjustments later. All right, enough about that. So here again, I mentioned here is my favorite tool. This is the ColorChecker Passport. Again, I'm not going to talk about it in detail today. But this one little device allows you to do both white balance and create a custom camera profile. Love it. Go to xwritephoto.com and check it out. That's all I'll say about it for today. No, I'll say a little more. I lied. I have spoken a lot in the past about profiles for monitors and printers. But a camera profile had been something very difficult to produce and implement. And once you see what it will do for your photography, you'll be amazed. You'll be wondering how you ever shot without it. So again, go to xwritephoto.com, and there's actually a Passport video on there with yours truly in it that you can watch and see exactly what it does. Okay, your monitor. Again, before you do any editing, you got to realize that your monitor, it's your window to your world. It's your viewfinder. Having a monitor that accurately shows you the correct tone, contrast, and color that's in your image is one of the most important pieces in any color workflow. And every monitor is going to benefit greatly from being calibrated and profiled. So let's just explore this a little bit more. Now, the terms calibration and profiling get mixed and confused a lot, but they mean two different things. Calibration is setting your basic parameters. It's your color temperature, your brightness, and your gamma or contrast setting. I'll talk about this in a little more detail later. Now, one of the other things you've really got to get under control is your monitor brightness or luminance. It's really important for anyone sending out files for printing, again, out to a lab or having a book done. out of the box, most monitors are set way too bright. Now, this makes DVDs and movies and the internet look bright and full of contrast, but for photography, it artificially lightens shadows in the images compared to the actual data in the file. And the result is prints that come back much darker than the image you viewed on your monitor. Now, I don't know how many of you guys are out there or have calibrated or profiled your monitor, but for example, if on this screen that you're seeing right now, if that image to the right of the monitor looks good, then your monitor is set way too bright. That should really appear very dark. This is one of the most common complaints I hear. I hear this from photographers all the time. They send out images out to a lab and then they come back too dark. And it's almost always the case that their monitor was just set way too bright. Now, I just got a message from somebody that they lost audio. I just want to make sure the rest of you can still hear me. If you can just let me know in the control panel if the audio is still good. And if not, okay. All right, so if you lost audio, then something happened on your end because everybody else has got it good. Thanks, guys. Okay, another thing that comes up all the time is monitor color temperature. I've had arguments with some labs about this, but I'm not going to back down on this one. There's a lot of debate about monitor color temperature, and I'm not going to get technical. But most monitors come out of the box with what's called a native white point or a color temperature of around 6500 K. Some older monitors are actually as blue as 9300 K. Now, for those of you that maybe were involved in standard printing, you guys are used to 5000 K setting. The problem with 5000 K is that it's a much warmer color temperature than the native white point for most monitors, and you might be able to successfully achieve that midtone. However, it's going to throw off the colors in the darker tones, because when you do a monitor adjustment, you're actually adjusting the curves of the monitor. It's like doing a curves adjustment in Photoshop, and it's not linear, and it causes a lot of problems. Only really high-end monitors can hold a 5000 K temperature, and strangely enough, I've tested this many times. For some reason, I don't know exactly all the physics behind it, but the image viewed on a 6500K monitor matches the print looked at in a 5000K viewing booth. I've showed this to some of our lab customers in their editing stations, and I've consistently found that this is the case. So 6500K, as far as brightness goes, somewhere between 80 and 120. If at all possible, never go above 120. If at all possible, go to 80. At 80 candelas, which is the kind of the lowest brightness that you can really control, you have the best tonal range in your images on screen. You've got the best shadow detail. You got the best highlight detail. The downside of 80 is if you've got a bright room, 80 is kind of dim for your monitor. So a compromise is 100 to 120. You don't want to go above that because then your highlights are going to be too your shadows rather are going to look too light. And the gamma is 2.2, the gamma or contrast curve. For you Mac guys who used to be at 1.8, everybody's at 2.2 now, so you want to switch to that. All right, we're going to get close to getting to the meat. By the way, thank you guys for your questions. If I don't answer your question right away, there's a good chance that I'm going to get to it in the presentation. So, but do keep them going. And oh, good question. Just came through. How about a laptop? And many laptops have an auto brightness setting that's based on the ambient light. My recommendation to you on that is turn it off. I've got an Apple MacBook Pro, which, by the way, is what I'm presenting to you on right now. And that first thing I do is I turn that off. Because I don't want it to be messing around with my calibration when I do it. And I need it to be consistent. My eyes will adjust better than letting my laptop jump up and down because it's gonna change the shadows. So you don't want that to happen. Now again, the settings, couple you asked, the settings are from 80 to 120 on brightness. Then the gamma is going to be 2.2, and the color temperature is going to be 6500K or D65 is another way of saying that. And this is in detail. I'm not going to actually go into the calibration softwares today. Check out the webinar schedule. I'm doing a monitor calibration webinar coming up shortly where I'll go into extreme detail on that. But until then, the softwares do take you through and they ask you the questions and they give you the correct settings. So when you actually run the software, it will show you that stuff. So after we got the calibration part set, then comes the profiling. And profiling means how to create a correct response for how colors are displayed on the monitor compared to what we're asking for. For example, say your software asks for your screen to be 100% blue. Well, but it doesn't really come up 100% blue. Say it's got 5% green in it. A profile corrects for that. And you can't do this by eye. This is where you need to have some hardware and software to do this. I'm just going to show you a couple of quick examples of that. And again, I'm not going to go into detail on this today. But our eyes are very adaptable to light and color and will compensate to changes automatically. We don't really notice a color temperature change when you walk into a room that's lit with tungsten light bulbs and then into another room that's got, say, standard office fluorescent tubes. Even though those temperature lights are very different colors, our eyes automatically adjust. We're also affected by our physical state. How much sleep you've had, how much sleep you need, how many Red Bulls you drank, how much alcohol or caffeine is in your system. All of these things affect your ability to perceive color. So let me just show you a couple of quick examples that illustrate some of these limitations. Now again, some of you may have seen stuff like this before. A very simple demonstration. Black and white backgrounds. The rectangles appear to be the same shades of gray, but when we connect them, you get to see they are actually different. Now the same thing, now we have rectangles that seem to be two different shades of gray. Let me get my screen caught up here. The one in the black appears to be lighter, but when we connect them, we see they are exactly the same. Now this happens with color as well. And you can kind of guess what's going to happen. The blue bars on the left in this appear to be much darker than those on the right. However, you guys know what's coming, right? I pull away the white bars, and you get to see they're actually, in fact, exactly the same blue. So, quick question break. Let's see. What would be a good question? Okay. Oh, a couple of you have iMacs. A little bit of warning about an iMac, because I have one as well here in our studio. Some iMacs have a tendency to be a little too bright. In fact, way too bright. And sometimes they are brighter than you can even adjust for. And I will go into that in a little bit detail just coming up, so stay tuned. And as far as editing your screen images, when you're doing your calibration and when you're doing editing, should you do it in complete darkness? Well, maybe not complete darkness, but you do want the monitor to be the brightest thing you're looking at. If you've got a lot of competing color around the room, especially if bright walls, that will affect how you're going to perceive the color. And a couple of you asked about monitor hoods. You know, where can you buy a monitor hood? Well, if you do the Google search on monitor hoods, you will find places that make them. However, the easiest way, if you can't find one, is go to your local craft store. You go to a Staples or a Michaels or an AC Moore or something like that. Buy yourself some black foam board that's got a matte surface and make your own. It's really simple. Okay, so we talked about the monitor. Now, two different types of equipment for doing your monitor calibration. If you're sending out your images to a lab for printing or just having books done, meaning you're not really doing much of your own printing, you're primarily sending out for printing, a colorimeter like the one you see here, this is the X-Rite i1 Display 2, is a great choice. It's easy to use. It does a great job of calibrating and profiling your monitor settings. It's also one of the least expensive systems that will get your monitor luminance under control, which is why I highly recommend it. Now, if you are doing your own printing, then you might want to consider another one of my favorite pieces of equipment. That's the ColorMonkey. The ColorMonkey also does monitors. The i1 Display 2 used to be my favorite monitor calibrator until I got a ColorMonkey. The beauty of the ColorMonkey is, a couple of things. One, it's really fast. And two, it also creates profiles for my printer. I can do custom profiles for my printer, and I can calibrate my LCD projector, which I do as well because that's how I present images to clients. So again, I'm not going to go into detail about this today, but check it out on xritephoto.com. Now again, a bunch of you asked about the monitor calibration settings, so here they are. D65 or 6500K, and we already spoke about why not 5000K. There's a particular big lab in the Midwest that I've had this argument with, and they won't listen, and I've got a couple of them converted over to 6500K for their monitors. It really does give you the best results on everywhere you have stuff printed. Again, 2.2 on the gamma. The luminance from 80 to 120. And by the way, you do not have to dim your room lights when you're doing your monitor calibration because the devices do fit pretty snugly up against the screen. So ambient light is fine. So here's how the thing works basically. When you put the device on your screen, the software just sends up different colors and they're known values. And the known values are compared to what actually shows up, and that's what the profile is built from those variations. And when it's done, everything gets put in the right place. It automatically gets saved, automatically gets implemented, and you don't have to worry about it anymore, but it's very important. Now, I did mention some monitors are just too bright. What do you do about it? Well, there's a couple of choices. There are utilities that will further dim the monitor. I know this, as I mentioned, I have one particular iMac that just will not come down far enough. There is a software called Shades. You can just Google that will further darken the monitor. However, all of these utilities that darken monitors also have an effect on color. So you want to make sure you don't judge color with this utility in play. Do your soft proofing without it turned on to do your color adjustments, and then you can just flick on the utility to further dim your monitor just to check brightness before going out. The other option is to get yourself a good monitor and plug it in. That's what we did for our iMac, actually. The iMac does have an output to another monitor, so we actually have another monitor plugged into the iMac that we do all our proofing on. All right, so we've got all our settings, our monitor set correct. We've got a good white balance on our image. Now let's start to talk about Photoshop. Now here's the window that you'll see in Photoshop, and we'll do this live in just a second. This is where you choose your color space and your color handling options. The defaults for CMYK are fine for most work, so I would leave them alone with one exception. So when we're going out to a blurb book, we want to actually bring up the blurb profile. Actually, you know what? I'm going to leave this for now. We'll go into Photoshop in just a couple more screens, and I'll show you this live. And soft proofing, as I mentioned, once you've got your monitor profiled, soft proofing is one of the greatest tools to ensure correctly printed files. And in essence, what Photoshop does is it shows on screen the effects that the output profile has on your image. And based on what changes occur, you can make your editing decisions with the soft proof preview turned on and make your adjustments before you actually print. And then no more printing 5 times to get that one good print. Now, one last item to discuss before we go into Photoshop, and that's let's discuss rendering intents. Now, there's 2 common rendering intents that we would deal with primarily as photographers, and there's really one that we're going to be focused on when we're dealing with our blurb books. Again, our cameras are capable of capturing much more color than most of our devices can actually print. So if your image has colors that can't be printed on the printer paper combination you're using, the rendering intent is going to decide how to print those colors by moving them into a printable range. And this is fairly common when you're dealing with really bright and saturated colors, particularly if you're going out to a matte paper. Now, if your image is fairly muted and no colors are out of gamut, then the rendering intent doesn't even come into play. Now let's talk about perceptual rendering first, because this is the rendering intent that is recommended for the blurb books, particularly when using BookSmart. Perceptual renderings has an ability to maintain color relationships. So let me just back up onto this little animation here. The colors that are outside of the circle here, these would be considered colors that are out of gamut. And when we deal with perceptual, what happens is these colors get moved in. However, colors that were in the way get moved out of the way so that the relationship between the colors is maintained. The good thing about that is it really prevents banding from happening if you have really large areas of solid color. Say you've got a sky that's deep blue at the top and it goes to lighter as it goes closer to the horizon. If you've got a lot of color out of gamut and the rendering intent is going to cause some of the colors to move, perceptual rendering will maintain those smooth gradations. The downside of perceptual rendering is you can have just a little bit of color out of gamut, and it can cause an overall tonal change that you may have to adjust. Now, relative colorimetric is the other common one, and the same thing happens. These colors that are out of gamut get moved back into the printable space. However, all the colors that were in gamut don't move. Now, this is good if you just have a little bit of color out of gamut, because you're not going to have any tonal changes in the image. The downside is, again, in that same kind of possibility where you've got a large area of a gradated color like a sky. If you move colors into gamut and the relationships get changed, that can end up causing some banding, which is very unattractive when you're having a book. So for printing out to a Blurb book, you're best off staying in the perceptual rendering mode. If you're going to be going out to your own desktop printer or out to a lab, then either of these will work, and it's a subjective choice, which we'll take a look at when we go into Photoshop. So I think we're ready to go into Photoshop. Oh, one thing before you go into Photoshop. Download the Blurb profile. If you go to blurb.com, and actually I'll show you the screen, and go under the help section, you'll see color management and the ability to download the Blurb ICC profile. And we want to use that because that's what we want to soft proof with before we go out to our books. Excuse me. Okay, now when we're using Blurb's BookSmart, BookSmart wants sRGB files that are going to be soft-proofed in Photoshop and then placed into the software. If you're using your own desktop publishing program like InDesign, which is what I like to use when I'm laying out books, then you need to soft-proof, and then you need to do one more step. We need to convert the file to the Blurb profile so that we then have a CMYK image that's ready to go. And we'll go through both of those possibilities. All right, so let's go into Photoshop and see how this all works. And let me hide this other stuff. All right, let's open up an image. Let's see, what do I want to start with here? Oh, let me just open one here. Let's open this one. This is nice and colorful. Okay, this is on the piers right near St. Augustine, Florida. And I want to see how this image is going to print in my book before I actually print it. And here's the process. Now, remember, we downloaded our profile from Blurb. Oh, before I do that, let's take a look at the color settings in Photoshop. Now, I do have a set for Blurb defaults. If you've never done this before, then it's going to default to North American prepress. So this is where it would be if you've never gone in and changed this. And you see the working space for RGB is Adobe RGB. CMYK is the standard web-coded, if anybody cares, specification for web offset printing. Nobody cares about that. We're not doing that. We're going out to a Blurb book. So as far as working spaces go, Adobe RGB, sRGB, ProPhoto RGB, when you're dealing with your RGB files, that's kind of up to you. Remember, though, and I will talk about this in detail in future webinars. If you guys really want to get into color, I'm going to be doing a webinar in January on color workflow in both Photoshop and Lightroom and go into color spaces in detail. For today's discussion, going out to Blurb, if we're using BookSmart, we do want to end up in sRGB because that's what it's asking for. And if we're going out to InDesign, we want our CMYK profile to be the Blurb profile. Now, under color management policies, oh, by the way, if you haven't seen these before, there's more options here, so it opens up the entire window for you. We always want to preserve the embedded profiles. We are going to do a profile conversion when we're done going out to InDesign, but for the time being, any image that we bring into Photoshop, we want to leave it alone. Don't change the profile. Now, there are some buttons down here, and this is a personal preference. I have this thing about being nagged, so don't bother me with a profile mismatch because just leave the, I've already told it, preserve the embedded profile, and then I'll change it when I'm done. So leave that alone. Ask when pasting is kind of handy, though. What that does is let's say you're working in an sRGB file and you want to composite. You want to bring another image into it and you copy and paste from another file. And let's say the other file was an Adobe RGB file. You do want to know that because you're going to cause a rendering intent in essence to take place when you convert down into a smaller space. So I do want to be alerted about that. Now, missing profiles, yeah, I will leave that one on. Missing profiles, it would be very rare. There are some applications that have been known to strip out profiles, but generally anything you're going to deal with is going to have a profile. So this would be an odd occurrence. Now, conversion engines, we don't really care, but we do want our intent when we're dealing with Blurb to be perceptual. And the rest of these buttons should be checked. The advanced controls, this is kind of a holdover again for like newsprint printing. We don't want to be bothered with this. So this doesn't concern us as photographers. Now that I've got all these settings, this is how I want everything set for Blurb. So you just save it. And you can see I have a button here to click on Save. And I will call it, I've already got Blurb default, so we'll call it Blurb 2. I already got a Blurb 2. We'll make it Blurb 4. And I'll just call it my Blurb demo defaults. And now in my set of menus, I've got this. So if I'm preparing some images that say I'm going to print on my large format inkjet, and I do want to be in ProPhoto RGB, for that, I will go to my ProPhoto defaults. So I can switch back and forth on my workflow depending on what it is I'm doing. So we've got everything set up for our Blurb printing. Now let's soft proof. Here's the process. It's actually fairly simple to do. You go to View, Proof Setup, Custom. And I had used my Blurb profile, so we were actually looking at it right now. And I can click the preview button on and off. And in this particular image, it's a very subtle change. I'm not even sure how well you're seeing it on your monitor. I will tell you one place you can look, and that's around the sun here, because we want to see if there's any colors out of gamut. The fact that I'm getting a very slight change does mean there are some colors out of gamut. So let's go to View and turn on the gamut warning. And we see here it is. You see the spot that turned green. Everybody always asks me, how do you get the gamut warning to be green? So let's just do that. Let me just click OK for a second here. If you go under Photoshop Preferences, under Transparency and Gamut, the gamut warning color default is like a gray like this, and it can be very hard to find, especially if you only have a little bit of color at a gamut. So I like to choose this kind of bright lime green. It makes it easy to see. So there's my gamut warning. So I don't have a lot of color out of gamut in here, just a little bit. And my change from the standard to the Blurb profile, really fairly minor. I'm getting a very slight lightening in the sky, but it's barely noticeable. So for this image, I know that I'm good to go. So I'm going to turn off my gamut warning, and I'll leave this image for now, and now I'm going to open up another one. Let's take this one, because I know this has some colors that are a little more out. All right, so I want to see how this image is going to print in my book. So again, I go to View, Proof Setup, Custom. And I turn my Blurb profile on and off, and I'm getting a little stronger change here. And where you can really see it, and I'm looking at this on another screen, so you guys are probably seeing it as well. If you look at the prow of this boat, this particular red is losing some intensity. Also, the sky up here is lightening. Not lightening, it is getting lighter. And you can see as I turn this on and off, we're seeing that overall change. So what that means is that we've got probably a little more color out of gamut. So let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at the gamut warning, and there it is. All that stuff that's in green is showing me those are colors that are beyond the book printing printer to print. Those colors are going to have to be moved. Now, we can't make colors print that don't exist on the printer. Sorry to say, just can't happen. So let's turn our proof colors back on, and let's see what kind of adjustment we can make. So we are looking at it through the Blurb profile. By the way, I could take a look at relative colorimetric and turn the preview on and see I have a slightly different change. The sky is getting a little lighter again, but again, the Blurb books don't prefer, You can get away with relative colorimetric in InDesign if all of your image is that way, but Blurb does highly recommend that you stick to Perceptual. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to leave it on Perceptual. And let's take a look. What can we do? Well, this sky did get a little lighter. So I'm going to darken that up just a smidge. And let's see, I just want the light parts of the sky to darken. So I'm going to create a blank layer, change it to overlay, and get black in my foreground and a nice big brush. I'll make it big. And by the way, for editing, if you choose a brush and hold down Control-Option on a Mac, Control-Alt on a PC, and drag left to right, the brush gets bigger. No more of that going to the brackets or changing your brush size up here. Also, if you go up and down, it changes the hardness of the brush. This single tip will probably save you more time than you can possibly imagine. And Eddie Tapp showed me that one. Thank you, Eddie. I know you were watching earlier. So I'm going to make myself a brush about that big. I'm going to work at about 10%. And I'm just going to darken that sky up a little bit. I'm going to do it down here too. So I can see as I turn this on and off, that's what I got. Now, this really light area up here is not being affected. This overlay burning and dodging technique, unfortunately, doesn't work if you've got something that's really, really light. So there's another way to do that. Let's do one more adjustment. I'm going to go into levels this time. And everyone is used to playing around with the sliders here to, oh, that will make it lighter, that'll make it darker. However, most people don't use the sliders underneath too much. And the output level sliders is what's going to allow you to bring down highlights. And I don't care about the rest of the image. All I'm looking at is this light part up top. And I'm going to bring that down by bringing the highlight output slider down. So notice the whole image is getting darker, but the light area is getting darker too. And that's what I'm after. Because I don't want your eyes, as a photographer, I want your focus to be in the middle of the image. And if I've got some kind of bright area up top, it's going to draw your eyes to it. And that's not what I want. So I'm going to darken that down and go back to my layers. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask it. Actually, I'm going to mask out the whole thing. Let's do that. I'm going to put black in the foreground right here, which you can do also by hitting X. I'm going to select the mask on the levels and hit Option Delete, which just filled the entire mask with black. So now nothing is happening. Nothing is getting through that levels adjustment I just did. Now if I paint with white, I'm going to use about 30%. If I paint with white over that light area, now that darkening starts to come through because that is what we did with the levels. So now what I did was I just made that light up on the top much more of a subtle effect. If you guys are really into landscape photography, by the way, I believe it's next Tuesday or Wednesday. If you go on to xwritephoto.com, you'll see under the Learning tab, under Webinars, you'll see upcoming webinars. I am doing an entire hour just on editing landscape photography in Photoshop. Okay. All right, so now I've got, yeah, that looks better. Now I don't have that top sky competing with what's all the interest going on in the middle. So we just went from here to here. And remember, we're looking at this through our profile. So this is what the image is going to print like. That's it. We're done. Now, if I'm sending this out to BookSmart, what I would simply do is save this, and I would save it as an sRGB JPEG. So one of the nice things about CS5 is when I do a save as, and I do a JPEG, I don't have to flatten it first. It's automatically going to do it for me. And notice I have sRGB as my profile. And click on save, and I do want the highest quality. And now this image is ready to go into my book. That's printing, looking exactly the way I want it. Now remember, we were soft proofing through the Blurb profile, which is a CMYK profile. But we saved it as an sRGB file because we wanted to see how it's going to print in the book. Now, if I want to take this image and prepare it for printing in InDesign, if I'm going to use the PDF to book workflow, which, by the way, there's another webinar on, I believe it's on the 8th. If you can see it on either Blurb or on XWrite Photo, I'm going to do a specific PDF to book webinar next week on just dealing with InDesign. We'll actually lay out a book in InDesign and do that. However, the last step, if I want to send this to prep this image to send it out to InDesign, is I need to convert it to the Blurb profile. Now, I'm not doing full-blown image editing today. A couple of you asked, do I sharpen, etc.? Yes, I do. That's, again, a subject for another day. Again, join me on the landscape editing webinar, and I will give you all kinds of different ways to sharpen and soften, for that matter. So if I'm ready to, I got my image the way I want it. I think it looks really good. Oh, I could take it one step further and, let's do it. What the heck? I'm going to give myself a real big brush at 10%, and I'm going to add a white swath in the middle through this overlay layer to kind of lighten up just the middle. Yeah, I like that. And in fact, I'm going to lighten up the little dude in the boat a little more too, and his little trail. And just by doing that one little effect, look what happened. We went from there to there, and it really changes the focus of the image just by doing that overlay burn layer. So again, join me next week and we'll go into this in real detail. So the image looks good. Here's the one extra step if I want to prepare this image for going out to my desktop publishing program. I need to do a convert to profile. And I need to convert it. This was an sRGB file. I need to convert it to the Blurb profile. Yes, I do want black point compensation. Yes, I do want a dither. And hit OK. Oh, I can go ahead and flatten it too, because I already saved it previously. Now, if we look at the image under mode, we see this is now a CMYK file. And that happened because we converted it to the Blurb profile. This image is now ready, once I save it, to go into my desktop publishing program. So if I'm going out into InDesign. And again, oh, somebody asked, how do you get out of soft proof? Well, let's back up a second. Good question. We should be back in RGB. I just undid that conversion. How do you get out of soft proof? Really simple. Just turn off proof colors, which is Command Y here. So here again is the soft proof turned on. If I want to turn it off, just click on that, and we're looking at the soft proof turned off. Very simple. Let's look at one more image. And because this one needs a slightly different fix. Oh, did I open the wrong one? Let's see. Sorry about that. I want this one. All right. This is kind of a fun, scary, and what were you thinking kind of image all in one. This is actually on my honeymoon this past June. This is in Mexico. And notice that despite the lightning strikes, and there were many of them, by the way, these kids are still in the water. Now, the lifeguards are pretty lax down there, but the lifeguards actually finally came up and said, what's wrong with you? Get out of the water. So when I do a soft proof on this, I can see that it's not an overall color change too much, but the area around the lightning bolt has gotten lighter. You see that when I turn that preview on? So let's leave the proof on. Oh, and let me go back to that because somebody just asked a good question. Okay, this display options, simulate paper color, simulate black ink thing. Great idea. Poorly implemented still. I was hoping in CS5 they'd fix this. What simulate paper color is supposed to do is simulate the effect the paper is going to have on the print. Unfortunately, it's way too heavy-handed. If I turn this on, even if I had, you could choose one of your own desktop printer papers. You could choose your premium glossy paper. And when you turn on this simulate paper color, it makes the thing go gray, especially around the borders where you have pure white. When with our own eyes, we can see that is not really the case. It's a personal preference kind of thing, but I find that my prints much more closely match without this turned on. So again, the same thing for simulate black ink. It's weak. Yes, matte papers, you lose some of the density of black, but nowhere near as much as this display options setting. So my recommendation to you is don't bother. You're going to find that when you just have your device to simulate set in the proof conditions, that this is what your images are going to come back looking like. It does really work very well. Okay, so hit OK there. So I have this image with my, again, see, we're looking at proof colors. It's lost a little bit of density I'll show you one of my favorite things to do to get some density back. And I'll just duplicate the layer. I can either do that by dragging to the folded page, or Command or Control on a PC, Control J, and then change the blending mode of that copy to overlay. Now it's going to be way extreme. Just relax a second. I'll bring it down typically to 25 to 30%. And that one little thing, just that one little copy, look what it did to the image. It took it from there to there. It gave it that pop back. And now I really like the image. It's going to have a lot more oomph when it prints. I really like that. I do this on many of my images. If you guys haven't tried this before, if you have landscape images, actually pretty much any image, that's just lacking a little bit of, I think the technical term would be oomph. This one little technique of duplicating the layer, changing it to overlay, and then turning the opacity down will add so much depth to your image. You're really going to love it. And this one's good to go, because we are looking at it through the proof colors. Love it. If I want, again, if I'm going to send it to BookSmart, I would do a save as. Save it as a JPEG. You see me have the sRGB profile embedded. Click on save. Yes, highest quality. If I was sending this out to my, preparing it for my InDesign book, I would then do that one extra step. Edit, convert to profile, choose the blurb profile. Yes, leave these checked. Yeah, I'll go ahead and flatten. Hit OK. Again, I can see under image mode that my file is now a CMYK file. And once again, do a save as. And this time I might save it as a J. I like to use JPEGs for books because I typically have a lot of images in books and the files get a little bit unwieldy if I leave them as Photoshop files or as TIFFs. But you can leave them as Photoshops as TIFF or TIFFs if you so choose. That's your personal preference. Me, I find I get great results by using a high quality JPEG. Yes, if you keep saving an image over and over and over, in a JPEG, it's going to get JPEGy. You're going to get those artifacts. So no, don't do that. But if I'm working initially with a Photoshop file or a RAW file, that first generation JPEG on a highest quality is going to print beautifully. So it just saves me a lot of space and time. All right. So we are done in Photoshop. And let's see. A couple of you asked about, another good question. All right. Here, which option is better? Is it better to use BookSmart or PDF to Book? Again, a very personal preference thing. BookSmart is a wonderful application. It's very simple to use. It's free. You can download great books on it. It's got great templates. Even though I'm an InDesign person, I just created my first BookSmart book, which I'm about to send up. And it works very well. Now, not everybody has InDesign and has the ability to create PDFs. InDesign is an expensive program, and it's fairly complicated to use. Yes, it gives you the greatest control, but if you're just going to create an occasional book, maybe you don't want to spend $600 for that. So BookSmart does a phenomenal job. Now, as far as 8-bit versus 16-bit images, someone asked that as well, 8-bit, 16-bit. If you're going to do serious editing on your images, especially if you're coming in RAW and you're going to do a lot of effects on them, yes, I would start in 16-bit. But do remember that when you finally save your file to be output, it's got to be down to 8-bit because that's what Blurb needs in both BookSmart and in InDesign. It's got to be an 8-bit file for the printer. Let's see. Any other questions? Okay, I think that's it for there. Let's continue on. Actually, I'm going to jump back into PowerPoint because I've got some screen captures here. Okay, so we have our images. Now, if we're going to go on BookSmart, BookSmart is a very simple software to use if you haven't used it. I'm not going to do a tutorial on BookSmart today. In fact, there's an excellent tutorial on BookSmart on Blurb's website that the Blurb folks did, so by all means, use it. Very easy to use. It's very intuitive, so go ahead. Now, if you are using InDesign, InDesign has a couple of more steps. Remember, we saved our images with the Blurb profile, which converted them to CMYK. You need to download a couple of things, again, from the Blurb website. You need to download the PDF X3 export preset. Again, when I do the PDF workflow webinar next week, I'll go into that in detail. But let's take a quick look at how we create the PDF when we're in here. You download that export preset. You also download the Blurb templates that are designed specifically for InDesign, and they are also downloadable from blurb.com. So here you see an image that's placed into the InDesign layout. Just to kind of make it a little bit bigger here. Let me just catch up with my other computer. Okay, so we see that one of the files we're using, it's been converted to the Blurb profile. It's saved as a CMYK file. And another thing about InDesign is those same color settings that we created in Photoshop. Remember we set the Blurb edits where we set our preferences. Once you create them in Photoshop, they'll also show up in InDesign, so you can dial those in as well. So before you send out, now if you're using the latest InDesign CS5, it automatically brings up the pre-flight window. If you have an older version, you have to go get it. And what pre-flight does, and it's under File Pre-Flight if you have an older version, the window shows you all of the images that are placed in your book so you can make sure they've all been converted into CMYK. Or if any are missing, it will let you know that. And here's a little detail of that. And you can see, well, this only had one image in it, not much of a book yet. Now, after you've done the pre-flight, you would generate your PDF book. Now, again, remember, we've downloaded all our templates into InDesign, and you are also supplied with that PDF preset. And when you install the Blurb preset, you'll see, as you can see right here, when you go to File, Adobe PDF Presets, the Blurb preset will show up. And it has all the correct settings for setting up to Blurb without you having to do anything. And then you're also offered the option of viewing your PDF after it's been exported immediately in Acrobat. A really good idea. And the other thing that is recommended is that you print your book on a local printer. A couple of good reasons for this. One, you can make sure that all your images, everything's in place where you want. It's also good to get a second set of eyes on your book, because you might see there might be an error, and we've all typed over the same paragraph over and over again, and you see words that look just fine, and then you realize that it's wrong. And yes, spell check is wonderful if you spelled it wrong, but if you just used a word that sounds the same, it will still be there. So good idea to have a second set of eyes. Take a look at your book before you send it up. So again, for the BookSmart users, the BookSmart, once it's laid out, automatically takes you through the upload to Blurb. If you're using your own program, again, like InDesign, there is a button called Use Your Own Program, which you see here right on their screen. And you just follow the directions for the PDF upload. It's, again, very simple to do. And I have done this myself. I recently did a book with all my images color managed. In fact, here's a photograph of my book. If you go on to blurb.com and just search my name, Joe Brady, you'll see this is a book on photography in the American Southwest. So take a look. There's a bunch of pages there that you can see. And as far as resolution, good question, resolution of images. You want to make sure, this is me personally, I generally work at 240 ppi. That's the resolution that I use. Some people like to use 300. It gives you a lot of leeway. I know there are a couple of Blurb folks here that are answering questions for you guys, by the way. Hello, everyone, to Lori and Joe from Blurb. They are here listening in and answering your questions as I speak. I have found that I can go as low as 180 dpi, and my images will still print just fine. You just want to make sure you don't go below that, though. So 240 is a good safety. 300 gives you a lot of room if you need to resize your images. But the books are phenomenal. And by following the steps that I just went through, I've proved it to many people. I've proved it myself. I've had Blurb books done, and I get beautiful books back, and all of the images look just like they did when I soft-proofed them in Photoshop. It's a wonderful thing. Just follow some steps, and you'll be good to go. All right, I'm going to relent. I wasn't going to do this, but too many people asked. So, all right, sharpening. I'll show you my favorite sharpening, okay? If I'm doing landscapes, my favorite sharpening is under Sharpen. Actually, let me turn this. Let me open the original RGB file. Here it is. Okay, is that it? Image? No. All right, let me just go back to RGB. Here's my favorite sharpening. Filter, sharpen, smart sharpen for my landscape work. Let me zoom into an area that is going to benefit from this. Now, my default settings are going to change depending on which camera I use. I use a bunch of different cameras, everything from a point and shoot up to a Mamiya digital back. This was shot with, I think this was shot with my Fuji S5. I shoot a Canon 5D Mark II. I also shoot a Nikon D700. So I'm camera agnostic. Depending on the resolution of the camera, and depending how much sharpness I want, you might notice that my sharpen setting is very high. I'll go up to 180%. This particular image doesn't need quite that much, maybe 100. The trick to me is I always make sure that the radius is below 1, because if I start to go above 1, you can see I'm starting to get some halos. And halos are a problem, and they look obviously like things have been sharpened. If you keep the radius below 1, you get a much smoother effect. Depending on what it is that you're trying to sharpen, if you've got something that's got a lot of grain in it, when I'm shooting it in the southwest, I make sure I want to bring out that sandstone texture. I will use a higher amount, and I will go up to 180. Yeah, I kind of like how it is separated out the leaves here on the trees, so I will do that. Now, the downside of this kind of sharpening is that will also sharpen the sky, which is going to add a little grain to it. So I always do my sharpening this way. I duplicate the background layer, Command or Control J, and I do my sharpening to that. Now, the reason I do it on a layer is because I don't want to sharpen the sky. So I create a mask, give myself a big giant black brush, make it really big, and I'll work at about 90%. And I just paint over the sky roughly here. And you can see, here's my mask. If I bring that up, you can see I just completely blocked out this part. And that's how I sharpen. And then when I look at this image at 100%, and this image is shrunk down for screen viewing, I have my good image. All right. So that's my favorite sharpening. I'll go into more again when I do the landscape Photoshop editing. If you guys are interested, go check out xwritephoto.com, and I'll be doing both landscape and portrait editing in Photoshop, and I'll go over in detail again all kinds of different sharpening and softening options. So, okay, so let's finish up. We're about out of time. So again, highly recommend, go on to blurb.com, check out the book. I was extremely happy when I got this book back. I did both a softcover and a hardcover version, and the images on both books match perfectly to what I had on my screen because I just followed those simple techniques. So let's sum up. We've talked about getting color. Get color right at capture if at all possible, because the sooner you get it under control, the less trouble you're going to have down the line. Monitors, yes, I keep harping on this. Your monitor's got to be calibrated and profiled. It's really important. Go over the soft proofing. If I went too fast for you, yes, this webinar is being recorded, so there'll be an option for you to review it. Also, I have more webinars coming up where I always do soft proofing in pretty much all of my webinars, so join me again. And if you're using BookSmart to create your books, make adjustments to your sRGB files based on the soft proof. If you're using InDesign or another publishing program and choosing the PDF to book workflow, convert your images to the Blurb profile, and then you're going to get the best results. If you follow these guidelines, you're going to get great results when printing your photos in your Blurb books. And if you have the right tools to make sure your color workflow is accurate, that we're going to give you the best color possible. There's a lot of great information on the Blurb website. Here you see blurb.com under the resources, the color management. Also on xwritephoto.com, there's a great set of tutorials and little videos there about monitor calibration. So again, that was a lot to cover in a pretty short period of time. I'd like to thank you all for spending this hour with us. This will be recorded, and in our follow-up email, we'll let you know where the recording is going to live as well, so you can review it at your leisure. So on behalf of Blurb and Xwrite, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you all online again soon. Have a great rest of the day, great rest of the week, and bye-bye.